Jonathan Winters stopped mid-joke. His face went white. His hands gripped the desk so hard his knuckles turned pale. The audience was still laughing. They had no idea what they were about to watch unfold in front of them. He folded forward, silent. Something had broken, live, in front of 300 people and a camera that never stopped rolling. And then Robin Williams stood up. No hesitation, no joke. He walked straight toward the man who taught him everything. 31 years old, the student, walking toward his idol's collapse like he'd been waiting his whole life for this exact moment. Wait. Because what he did in the next 90 seconds explains a debt neither man ever spoke about publicly. Until now. Before we go further, 10 seconds. Check if you're subscribed. Some of you aren't and don't know it. It costs nothing. It means this story reaches you when it's ready. Thank you for being here. Now, go back with me, not to the stage, to a living room in Ohio, 1962, a 9-year-old boy. A flickering black and white television. He is watching a man do something he has never seen before, something that will define the next 50 years of his life. The boy is Robin Williams, and the man on the screen is about to become his entire reason for existing. Jonathan Winters was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1925, and by the time Robin Williams was born in Chicago in 1951, Winters had already begun developing the specific and genuinely unprecedented improvisational comedic style that would eventually influence an entire generation of American comedians in ways that almost nobody at the time fully recognized. Winters did not tell jokes in the conventional sense. He generated entire universes of characters and voices in real time, apparently without any prepared structure, moving between an elderly Maud Frickert to a Southern preacher to an entire imagined radio broadcast, all within a single unbroken improvisational stream that left audiences and fellow performers genuinely uncertain how a human mind could generate that much material that quickly without any visible preparation. The specific circumstances surrounding Winters' 1959 hospitalization deserve fuller understanding, because they illuminate exactly what both men were carrying, separately and together, into the broadcast years later. During a public appearance in San Francisco, Winters climbed the rigging of a docked ship in what witnesses at the time described as a state of genuine and frightening confusion, believing, according to accounts given afterward, that he was under attack by pirates, a break from reality serious enough that he was subsequently hospitalized for several months. He spoke about this period in later years, with unusual and often startling candor for a performer of his generation, describing the specific terror of feeling that the same boundless imaginative velocity that made him extraordinary on stage had, without warning, become something he could no longer reliably control or distinguish from genuine reality. He returned to performing, eventually, but according to people close to him, he carried a specific and lifelong vigilance afterward, a private awareness that the exact gift that made him beloved by millions of Americans also carried, within it, the potential for a kind of collapse that very few of his audiences ever fully understood or expected from a man whose public persona suggested endless, inexhaustible good humor. What almost nobody outside his closest professional circle fully understood was the specific and considerable cost of generating that much material that consistently, because Jonathan Winters, throughout his career, struggled with serious mental health difficulties that he discussed with unusual candor for his era, difficulties that existed in direct and often painful tension with the explosive, boundaryless creative energy that made his comedy so genuinely unprecedented. He performed, in other words, from a place that was simultaneously his greatest professional gift and a source of genuine private suffering, a combination that a young Robin Williams, watching him on television as a child in Chicago, could not possibly have understood at the time, but that would eventually become the exact template for Williams' own adult career, and eventually, the exact template for a specific kind of exhaustion that both men would carry for decades. Robin Williams has said, in numerous interviews given across his career, that Jonathan Winters was the single most important influence on his entire comedic development, more significant than any other performer he encountered in his formative years. He first saw Winters on television as a child and has described the specific experience of watching him with a language that suggests something closer to religious revelation than ordinary childhood entertainment. A sudden and total recognition that the private imaginative overflow Williams had already been generating alone in his own isolated childhood. The voices and characters he had been inventing to fill the loneliness of a large, quiet house was not simply a private coping mechanism, but something that could actually become a legitimate, extraordinary, publicly celebrated art form. This recognition, according to Williams' own later accounts, changed the entire trajectory of his life, giving him, for the first time, a model for exactly what he might become. When Williams eventually broke into professional comedy in the San Francisco stand-up scene of the mid-1970s, critics and fellow performers immediately and consistently noted the specific stylistic lineage connecting his work directly back to Winters. The same rapid-fire improvisational character work, the same apparent boundlessness of imaginative material, the same quality of watching someone's actual unfiltered thoughts happening in real time rather than watching a rehearsed performance. What almost nobody understood watching this stylistic inheritance unfold publicly was that Williams had also, without necessarily choosing to, inherited something considerably less celebrated from his idol: the specific cost of generating that much creative energy that consistently, a cost that both men would carry largely in private for the remainder of their careers. Wait, because what happened when these two men finally met in person, years before the incident on Johnny Carson's stage, and what Robin Williams did in the moments immediately before that broadcast even began, reveals something about this relationship that has never been fully told before. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. Because what happens on that stage in a few minutes is unlike almost anything either of these two extraordinary performers ever did together in public again. Now, back to the specific evening in question, an evening that would ultimately reveal, in front of millions of viewers, exactly how completely the roles between mentor and student had quietly reversed. Robin Williams and Jonathan Winters first met in person in the late 1970s, backstage at a television production where both men were appearing separately. And according to multiple accounts from people present, Williams was so overwhelmed by finally meeting his childhood idol in person that he was, for several minutes, uncharacteristically unable to generate his usual explosive conversational energy, reduced instead to something closer to genuine awestruck shyness. Winters, according to these same accounts, immediately recognized something specific and significant in the young comedian standing before him. Not simply admiration, but a genuine creative kinship. The recognition of someone who had independently developed a version of exactly the same improvisational gift that Winters himself possessed. The two men developed, over the following years, a friendship that went considerably deeper than the ordinary professional courtesy that typically exists between an established performer and an admiring younger colleague. Winters became, for Williams, something between a mentor and an older brother, offering guidance not simply on comedic technique but on the considerably more difficult question of how to survive. Privately, the specific psychological cost of a creative gift that operated, for both men without any reliable internal governor, generating material constantly and often uncontrollably, regardless of whether the person generating it actually had the internal resources available to sustain that output. Williams, in later interviews, described conversations with Winters during this period that touched on subjects Winters rarely discussed publicly: his own hospitalization in 1959, the specific terror of feeling that his own mind operated at a velocity he could not always control, the particular loneliness of being, professionally, the most entertaining person in almost every room while privately managing something that felt considerably less entertaining and considerably more frightening. These conversations, according to Williams, gave him language and permission for feelings about his own creative process that he had never previously had anyone to discuss them with, a gift that Williams later said he considered more valuable than anything Winters had taught him about comedic technique itself. By the early 1980s, both men had appeared together on The Tonight Show on several previous occasions. each appearance generating the specific electric unpredictability that comes from pairing two performers whose comedic instincts operate at genuinely similar and genuinely uncontrolled velocities. By this point in his career, Robin Williams had achieved a level of mainstream fame that even Jonathan Winters, watching his former student's rapid ascent, found genuinely remarkable. Having become a household name through his starring role as the alien Mork in the television series Mork and Mindy, a role that had originated in one of the more improbable full-circle moments in American television history. From a single guest appearance on the sitcom Happy Days that had itself been built around a specific creative decision to allow Williams almost total improvisational freedom, a decision the show's producers made specifically because they had heard, through industry channels, about the young comedian's uncanny ability to generate material in exactly the free associative, character-driven style that Jonathan Winters had spent decades perfecting. Winters, watching this unfold, reportedly told a mutual friend that seeing Williams succeed at that scale using techniques so directly inherited from his own decades of work felt less like watching a student, surpass his teacher, and more like watching an idea he had spent his whole career trying to prove was possible finally received the mainstream validation it had always deserved. A validation Winters himself, despite his own considerable success, had never quite received in the same total and unqualified form. This specific dynamic, an older master watching his student achieve a version of mainstream success that had partially eluded him, could easily have produced resentment or bitterness in a lesser man. But by every account from people who knew both performers during this period, Winters felt nothing but genuine pride, describing Williams' success in one interview given during this era as proof that everything he believed about the value of fearless improvisational comedy had been correct all along, vindication delivered not through his own career, but through the career of someone he had genuinely come to love as something between a student and a son. Johnny Carson had, by this point, learned to simply let these appearances unfold with minimal interference, understanding that attempting to impose conventional interview structure onto a conversation between Winters and Williams was both futile and considerably less entertaining than simply allowing their combined improvisational energy to generate whatever it was going to generate. What made the broadcast in question different from their previous appearances together, according to the production staff who were present, began not on the stage itself but in the shared green room before the taping, in a conversation between the two men that nobody else was present for in full, but that a production assistant partially overheard while delivering refreshments. According to this partial account, Jonathan Winters, in the minutes before the broadcast, mentioned to Williams, in a tone the assistant described as unusually subdued for a man about to go on stage, that he had been having a particularly difficult week privately, without elaborating further, and Williams, according to this same account, had responded not with his usual explosive comedic deflection, but with something quieter, asking Winters directly whether he felt ready to perform that evening. Winters, according to the assistant's account, said that he thought so, that performing sometimes helped, that the stage was sometimes the only place where the velocity of his own mind felt like an asset rather than a burden. Williams reportedly told him, quietly, that he understood exactly what that felt like, and that if anything happened out there, Winters should know that Williams would be right beside him. Wait, because this private exchange, occurring only minutes before the cameras began rolling, explains everything about the speed and the certainty with which Robin Williams responded to what happened next. The broadcast began with both men delivering an extended improvisational segment together that the studio audience found genuinely uproarious. Winters and Williams moving between characters and voices with a combined velocity that even veteran production staff described as some of the most purely entertaining unscripted television the show had produced in years. Winters, according to everyone present, seemed entirely in command of the material, generating character after character with his usual apparent effortlessness. Williams matching and occasionally amplifying his energy in a call-and-response dynamic that delighted the audience for several sustained minutes. And then, according to the account preserved by the show's sound engineer who reviewed the tape afterward, something shifted, subtly at first, in the specific quality of Winter's voice, a slight and almost imperceptible flattening underneath the continued comedic delivery. The sound, on close listening, of someone whose performance had begun operating on pure trained momentum rather than genuine present energy. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Jonathan Winters stopped mid-character. His face, which had been in constant animated motion for several minutes, went suddenly and completely still, and then, without any transition, folded forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard that his knuckles visibly whitened, his breathing audible even through the studio microphones. The studio audience, still processing the sudden silence after minutes of continuous laughter, took a moment to register that something had genuinely changed, several people beginning to rise slightly from their seats in visible concern. Johnny Carson, seated between the two men, began to react with the specific alarm of a host who had, in this exact circumstance with Robin Williams and Fred Rogers years later, already learned how quickly a comedic broadcast could become something considerably more serious. But before Carson could fully process what response the moment required, Robin Williams was already moving. He stood up from his own chair immediately, without a single visible second of hesitation, and walked directly to where Jonathan Winters sat folded forward over the desk, his entire posture carrying a specific and unmistakable quality of collapse that the cameras captured with devastating clarity. Williams knelt down beside Winters' chair, bringing himself physically lower than his mentor rather than standing over him, and placed one hand gently on Winters' shoulder. He did not attempt to make a joke of the moment, a restraint that several members of the production staff later described as remarkable, given Williams' established reputation for reflexively transforming almost any situation into comedic material. He simply said, quietly enough that the boom microphone barely caught it, but clearly enough that it has since been confirmed by multiple people who reviewed the broadcast tape, "I'm right here, Jonathan. Just breathe. I've got you." Winters, after a long moment, lifted his head slightly, his face carrying an expression of genuine exhaustion that millions of viewers had never before seen from a performer whose public persona had always suggested boundless, inexhaustible comedic energy. He said, his voice cracking, his hand still gripping the desk, "I don't know what happened. I just felt it all catch up with me at once." Williams, still kneeling beside him, said, "I know exactly what that feels like. You taught me everything I know about doing this, Jonathan, and I promise you don't have to keep doing it perfectly every single second. Not with me. Not tonight." What followed was not, in any conventional sense, entertainment. Johnny Carson, watching this unfold from behind his own desk, made the deliberate decision, according to production staff present, not to redirect the segment back toward its original comedic framing, understanding that what was happening in front of him carried a weight considerably more significant than the broadcast's planned structure. Williams remained kneeling beside Winters for several long minutes, occasionally speaking quietly, occasionally simply present in silence, offering his mentor exactly the kind of unhurried, undemanding presence that Winters had, without either man perhaps fully realizing it at the time. Spent years modeling for Williams through countless private conversations about the specific cost of their shared creative gift. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting an evening of explosive comedic entertainment, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely moved silence they had experienced at a live taping, watching a younger performer offer his idol exactly the kind of care that idol had quietly offered him for years without any public acknowledgement. NBC's switchboard, according to the production staff who monitored it in the hours immediately following the broadcast, received an unusually high volume of calls from viewers describing the segment as one of the most genuinely moving things they had witnessed on television in years, many of them specifically noting the reversal of roles they had just watched unfold, an older mentor visibly needing support and a younger student offering it without a single moment of hesitation or discomfort. Several callers, according to the production staff member who logged viewer responses that week, specifically mentioned family relationships of their own, adult children who had begun, in recent years, quietly caring for aging parents who had once cared for them, and who said that watching Robin Williams kneel beside Jonathan Winters had given them a specific and moving vocabulary for an experience they had never quite had words for previously. The particular tenderness and particular grief of watching someone who once seemed invincible reveal, for the first time, genuine and undeniable vulnerability. This response suggested that what had happened on that stage, beyond the specific story of these two extraordinary comedic minds, had touched something considerably more universal about the way care moves between generations, not always flowing in the direction that seems most natural or expected, but circling back when it is needed most, from student to teacher, from child to parent, from the person who once needed protecting to the person who once did the protecting. In the years that followed that broadcast, according to people close to both men, their relationship deepened in ways that went considerably beyond the professional courtesy that had characterized their earlier friendship. Williams began, according to several accounts, checking in on Winters privately with a regularity that surprised even Winters' own family, calls that had nothing to do with career matters or upcoming projects, simply brief conversations in which Williams would ask, directly and without any comedic deflection, how his mentor was actually doing that particular week. Winters, for his part, began speaking about his own private struggles with considerably more openness than he had ever previously allowed himself, telling one interviewer in the mid-1980s that he had spent decades believing that admitting difficulty would somehow diminish what audiences valued about his work, and that watching Robin Williams respond to his collapse on that Tonight Show stage with such immediate and unconditional care, rather than any hint of embarrassment or diminished respect, had taught him something he wished he had understood decades earlier, that genuine vulnerability, rather than undermining the fearless creative courage both men were known for, was in fact the exact source from which that courage had always originated. This shift in Winters' own public candor, several biographers have since noted, coincided with a period of noticeably improved stability in his personal life, a correlation that friends close to him were quick to credit, at least in part to the specific example Williams had set that evening. Proof, delivered in front of millions of viewers, that admitting exhaustion did not have to mean the end of being seen as remarkable. When Winters finally composed himself enough to sit upright again, he looked at Williams with an expression that several people present described as something between profound gratitude and genuine surprise. The specific surprise of a mentor discovering that his student had absorbed something considerably more important than comedic technique. He said quietly, "When did you become the one taking care of me?" Williams, still holding his shoulder, said, "I think I've been trying to for years, Jonathan. You just never let anyone see when you needed it before tonight." The studio audience, absorbing the full weight of this exchange, began to applaud. Not the raucous, laughter-driven response their earlier improvisational segment had produced, but something considerably quieter and more sustained. The sound of an audience honoring something genuinely true rather than simply responding to entertainment. Robin Williams referenced that broadcast in later interviews given across the following decades, describing it as one of the moments he was proudest of in his entire career, not because of anything he had performed comedically, but because it represented, for him, the first time he had ever been able to offer Jonathan Winters even a fraction of what Winters had given him, both as an artistic influence and as one of the only people in his early career who had ever discussed the private cost of their shared creative gift honestly. He said in one particularly candid later interview that watching Jonathan Winters collapse on that stage had terrified him, not simply because he cared deeply for a man who had shaped his entire artistic identity, but because he recognized with sudden and uncomfortable clarity that he was watching a preview of exactly what his own future might hold if he never learned to set down the exhausting weight of constant performance the way Winters, in that moment, had finally been forced to. Jonathan Winters, for his part, spoke about that broadcast rarely in public, consistent with his own complicated and often private relationship with his mental health struggles. But people close to him said he considered it one of the clearest demonstrations, across his entire career, that the specific gift he had spent decades trying to model for younger performers, the courage to generate material fearlessly from the deepest and strangest parts of your own imagination, had been received by at least one student with a completeness that went considerably beyond comedic technique, extending into something considerably more personal and considerably more valuable: the willingness to offer genuine care in return at exactly the moment care was needed most. If this story has moved you tonight, I want you to sit with something for a moment before you close this video. Jonathan Winters spent decades teaching Robin Williams, both directly and through the simple example of his own fearless creative courage, everything he knew about generating comedy from the deepest parts of his imagination. And it took one unexpected moment of genuine collapse for Williams to finally return that gift in a form considerably more valuable than comedic influence: the simple and profoundly rare offering of complete, unhurried presence at exactly the moment his mentor needed it most. Think about the people in your own life who taught you something valuable years ago. People you may have never fully repaid for what they gave you. You do not need a television stage or a moment of dramatic collapse to offer them something back. You simply need to notice when they, too, occasionally need someone else to be strong for them, and to be willing, when that moment arrives, to kneel down beside them and say, quietly, "I'm right here. I've got you." If you have not yet joined this channel's community, please consider doing so now. The link is below, and becoming a member helps make these deeply researched stories possible for everyone who watches. Please like this video if it moved you tonight, because every single like helps this story find someone else who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already, so the next story reaches you the moment it is ready. And in the comments below, tell me, is there someone in your life who taught you something valuable years ago? Someone you have never fully found the chance to repay? Tell me about them. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Because somewhere out there right now, someone who once taught you everything you know is quietly struggling with something they have never let you see, waiting for you to finally notice and to finally have the chance to give back even a fraction of what they once gave you. There is one more detail about that broadcast that deserves to be understood more fully, something that only becomes visible when you examine what happened in the years immediately following, particularly during the final years of Jonathan Winters' life. Winters died on April 11, 2013, at the age of 87, following a long and full career that had, by that point, secured his reputation as one of the most genuinely influential comedic minds in American entertainment history. Robin Williams, upon hearing the news, gave a public statement that specifically referenced the Tonight Show broadcast from decades earlier, describing it as one of the defining moments of his own relationship with his mentor, a moment when the specific and unspoken debt he had carried since childhood. Since a 9-year-old boy in Chicago first watched a stranger on television and recognized something about his own private imaginative world reflected back at him for the first time, had finally found at least partial expression. He said that Jonathan Winters had taught him that fearless imagination and genuine private suffering could exist within exactly the same person, that these were not contradictions to be resolved, but simply two aspects of the same singular and remarkable creative gift, and that understanding this, watching Winters live it openly rather than hide it, had given Williams a considerably more honest relationship with his own comedic identity than he might otherwise have developed. Williams himself died on August 11, 2014, only 16 months after Winters, and in the extensive public reflection that followed his own death, several close friends and colleagues specifically cited the Tonight Show moment with Winters as evidence of a quality in Williams that his relentless public comedic energy sometimes obscured, a genuine and deeply felt capacity for care that he extended, whenever the opportunity arose, to the people who had shaped him most significantly, even when, as was so often the case throughout both of their careers, offering that care to others proved considerably easier than offering it to themselves. Perhaps that is the truest epilogue to this entire story. Two men who spent their careers giving audiences access to the most fearless and unfiltered corners of their own imaginations, who each, in turn, taught the other something essential about surviving the private cost of that fearlessness, and who found, in one unplanned and deeply human moment on a television stage, the specific and rare permission to finally set down, if only briefly, the exhausting weight of always needing to be the one who made everyone else laugh. There is one final piece of this story worth understanding. something that surfaced only years later in a conversation Robin Williams had with a documentary filmmaker researching the history of American comedic improvisation. Williams described in that conversation a specific memory from childhood that he said he had never previously shared publicly, a memory of his own father, a man Williams described as loving but emotionally distant in the particular way common to men of his generation. Watching Jonathan Winters on television alongside his young son and laughing, genuinely and openly, in a manner Williams said he witnessed from his father perhaps only a handful of times throughout his entire childhood. Williams said that watching his own father's guarded composure crack open, even briefly, in response to Winters' performance had taught him something profound and lasting about the specific power of comedy to reach places in another person that ordinary conversation simply could not access, a lesson that became, in retrospect, the entire foundation of his own life's work. This detail adds a further layer of meaning to what happened on that Tonight Show stage decades later, because in kneeling beside his collapsing mentor and offering him wordless, unconditional presence, Robin Williams was not simply repaying a debt to the man who had taught him comedic technique. He was, in some sense, also honoring the specific and rare gift Jonathan Winters had once given an entire generation of emotionally guarded American men and their children. The gift of laughter so genuine and so disarming that it could crack open even the most carefully maintained emotional distance, if only for the length of a single television broadcast. In offering Winters his own version of that same unguarded, disarming presence, Williams completed a circle that had begun decades earlier in a quiet living room in Chicago, proving, in the most direct and personal way imaginable, that the specific gift his mentor had spent a lifetime giving to strangers could also, when it mattered most, be given back to him.